It was a deadly blast, and it was devastating. In Afghanistan, 90 were killed, with a death toll that may climb. The Daesh terrorist group has claimed responsibility. Even the Taliban did not approve of the attack. In this debate, we'll discuss why a country that has been occupied by foreign forces, like from NATO countries and the U.S., is still susceptible to violence and acts of terrorism. Well, I guess joining us for this edition of the debate, we have Jason Unruhe. He's a political commentator and analyst who joins us from Niagara Falls. And from Washington, we have Lawrence Korb, U.S. foreign policy and national security analyst. Gentlemen, welcome. Let me start with you, Lawrence Korb. This is perhaps one of the worst terrorist incidents to happen, not only for Afghanistan, in which at this point 90 people have been killed, but also around the world. What is your reaction when you heard about this?
Well, it's just horrible. As you mentioned, all of the the governments, including your own, have condemned it. I mean, it was senseless. Most of the people killed were innocent civilians on their way to work. They put it not only where the embassies are, but the main part of the shopping center and rush hour. So that obviously the attempt was to kill as many innocent civilians as they could, and so that's what makes all bombings are horrible. But this is even worse, given the extent of the damage.
Jason Unruhe, when we take a look at the reasons for something like this to happen, and this is just plain out there, many have deducted and have analyzed this and reached one conclusion, and that is that this is a country that has been occupied for 16 years. Some call it that. And you have foreign forces in there, namely from the U.S. and NATO countries. But yet after 16 years, this is what it has come down to. Why do you think that that is a appropriate and just argument to blame it on the occupation and on foreign forces?
I think it's certainly a fair assessment to make. The invasion of Afghanistan by foreign powers was an act that was intended to rein in the country to the interests of Western powers. To see acts like this, as senseless and violent as they are the natural product of destabilizing a society, however stable it was under the Taliban.
Lawrence Korb, what about the fact that you have several countries that have their troops in Afghanistan, and namely at this point, I think the U.S. has the biggest contingent, up to 10,000, if I'm correct. Of course, there have been requests for a troop increase in a few thousand. Do you think that the U.S. has done more good for Afghanistan than bad, based on how you have seen U.S.'s involvement in the past 16 years?
Is that to me?
Yes. Lawrence Korb.
Oh, okay. Well, first of all, I think it's important to keep in mind that after the attacks of 9/11, President Bush told the Taliban, if you turn over al-Qaeda and not give them a haven, we will not come in. They refused to do that. NATO invoked Article 5, and so it was not just a U.S. operation. We were aided by a lot of countries, including Iran, which basically got the Northern Alliance to help us. They also furnished us intelligence to go after the al-Qaeda there. We drove them out. Unfortunately, we couldn't get a government that had the support of all the people, and the Taliban were able to come back in. Ironically, one of the reasons they came back in is we then turned our attention, we the United States, to Iraq and allowed them to come back in. But, you know, right now, it's so much different. I mean, President Obama wanted to basically get out by the end of his term. The Afghan government under the current Afghan government under President Ghani and Abdullah have asked us to stay. They have asked us to increase the number of troops. We have 8,400. They've asked for several other thousand. And as you mentioned, it's not just us. You also have NATO has about 4,000 troops there. We did start negotiations with the Taliban, but then when they started winning, they backed out of the negotiations. I think the United States and its NATO allies would be more than happy to come up with a power-sharing arrangement that allowed the Taliban, if they support the Afghan constitution, to come back and have you know, a role in running the government. It's complicated now because ISIS as they've been drawn out, as they've been beaten back in Iraq and Syria, have come over to Afghanistan, and they're causing the problems. The Taliban said they were not responsible for this bombing today. We assume that it was ISIS who did this.
Yeah, they have actually, the Daesh has taken responsibility for this. Just on Unruhe, so by 2017, the U.S. troops were supposed to be out of Afghanistan, yet there are news indicating, by even some accounts within the U.S. military, that it might take decades for the U.S. to leave. First of all, what is the U.S. still doing in Afghanistan?
Well, the United States is still in Afghanistan basically because the government there is not stable enough to continue to operate on its own. The placement of this government is seen largely by many people as strictly a puppet government for U.S. interests. And this is an opinion that is shared by many people in Afghanistan. This is a government that was placed into power after an invasion by coalition forces. I think the reason why is that it lacks legitimacy in the eyes of a lot of Afghan people, and rightfully so. The U.S. has focused more efforts on trying to contain the Taliban rather than deal with trying to keep the government of Afghanistan running. One of the major problems is the ongoing corruption that exists within the government. A great deal of money is being stolen. In fact, Afghanistan was rated as one of the most corrupt countries in the world, and this is an ongoing problem. A lack of particular development in terms of creating jobs also seems to be a major problem as well. Many of the farmers in Afghanistan are very much turning towards opium cultivation in order to survive, in order to make enough money to feed their families, etc. And the lack of a sufficient development of a formal economy has driven a lot of people into the hands of the Taliban. But this is also a very difficult situation to deal with given the sparseness of the Afghan population. It is difficult to build that much infrastructure, so to speak, in such a large area. But I think the main problem is the lack of legitimacy that people see in the government as a result of the invasion, and a tremendous destabilization happens as a result of that. Not many people recognize the Afghan government as a legitimate authority in the country.
Well, let's just take a look, perhaps Lawrence Corp, you can explain to us, let's take a look at why the Taliban, first of all, have not been defeated in Afghanistan. It always was a big question mark how, when you, at the height of it, you had thousands and thousands from NATO and the U.S. also, but they couldn't defeat, what was it, about 4,000 or 5,000 of these Taliban. And you just said that, the Daesh terrorists, they're being defeated in Iraq and Syria, so they are now appearing in Afghanistan, and yet they're not being defeated. Why is it that these groups are not being defeated? I mean, even when you have more troops from what is acclaimed by the U.S. to be a superpower, or the U.S. to be having an army that's capable of defeating them, and of course of NATO member countries also having the equipment and numbers to defeat them, but yet they're not being defeated. Why is that?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, when the United States drove out al-Qaeda, they went into, and the Taliban, they went into Pakistan, and Pakistan, which seems to be on both sides of the issue, gave them aid and comfort. They're concerned about India having too much influence in Afghanistan. They allowed them to regroup. The Bonn Conference set up Karzai, and again, that was an international conference led by Lakhdar Brahimi. It was the UN, and in fact, if you go back and you take a look, a lot of countries, including your own, persuaded the Northern Alliance to support Karzai. But as my colleague up in Niagara Falls said, the government, Karzai, was very corrupt. There was an awful lot of corruption going on. And while Ghani and Abdullah got elected, and the election was reasonably fair, I wouldn't say it was a model of efficiency, the fact is they have not been able to weed out the corruption. And you can't win a war, okay, you can defeat somebody militarily, but you can't defeat them psychologically if in fact there's nobody to support, because that's the problem, that you can win the war, but win the battles but lose the war until you have a government in there that the majority of the people want. And that's why we should have negotiations with the Taliban. But when you have a government that doesn't have the support of the people, you're going to have insurgencies flower and come up, and basically that's been part of the problem. I mean, the great irony is that Ghani is more of a Democrat. He doesn't use military force as much as, say, some of the other leaders in the Middle East, like the Egyptians do, to quell, what's going on among the people. So, I mean, I think that's what it is. Basically, you can win the battles, but you're not going to win the war until you get a government that the people in that country support. And I think it's going to be, to solve this, you got to get with the Taliban and all the countries in the region, because nobody wants an unstable Afghanistan. And as I mentioned, President Obama wanted to leave. He wanted to get out by the end of his term, but the Afghan government persuaded him to leave 8,400 troops there.
Well, winning the hearts and minds, Jason Unruhe, sounds like that old strategy that the U.S. had, and I forget the name of the colonel or general that was operating with that in mind. And he was actually able to actually achieve that to some extent, but not fully. But I'm curious, when you have the U.S. drop what's called the mother of all bombs in Afghanistan, and I'm a Daesh terrorist, what kind of consequence is going to come out of that? What kind of reaction would a terrorist have to that, or even plain Afghans?
Well, it certainly sends a mixed message. One cannot claim that they are there in peace while they're bombing the country. And while sometimes that can achieve the objective, it's very hard to see that in the eyes of the Afghan people. If they say they're coming there to help you, to make your lives better, to install a legitimate government, and then carry out bombings like that, which almost always end up with a ton of innocent people being killed, people tend not to see the proclaimed reason for the occupation to be legitimate. And a lot of people are going to turn against them as a result of that. And I think there's, frankly, a lot of a lack of knowledge on the part of the Afghan population. I remember several years ago, there was a study done that showed 95% of the Afghan population had, even years after the war, had never heard of 9/11. Meaning, as far as they were concerned, they saw no actual real reason for the United States to invade Afghanistan. In their eyes, if they never knew the justification for invading the country, things would seem very different to them indeed. But the way the U.S. occupation has manifested itself, it's been more concerned with physically destroying the Taliban than creating an alternative to the Taliban. People are far less likely to trust what the occupiers are telling them.
Well, that's a very, very dangerous thing there, Lawrence Cole, based on a study that Jason Unruhe has said there. Because at this point, given the fact that it's 16 years after the 9/11 attacks, you have many people, or Afghans, that aren't aware of what the intentions of the U.S. was, I guess, or what even that incident was. But let's talk about how some headlines are reading a piece of news that's been kind of featured here and there, and I'm wondering why, if maybe you have some explanation, and that is Afghanistan, the next big U.S.-Russia proxy battle. Do you agree with that, and why would that be?
Well, the Russians, ironically, were helping us for quite a while. They were allowing supplies and troops to come in through Russia and their former satellites into Afghanistan. But then when relations soured between Putin and Obama, things changed. And I think what the Russians want to do is they want to keep us on the defensive and destabilize us with a small investment, if you will, in terms of material and money. They can make life difficult for us in Afghanistan, and their feeling is that if we're busy there, then we won't be able to focus, for example, on Crimea or the Baltic. So there's no doubt about the fact they've taken advantage of the situation. But as I say, the problem has been, and things are not great in Afghanistan, particularly given what happened. But there's been a lot of, the Taliban were horrible rulers. What they did to women, and what they executions and things like that. They didn't have great amount of support when they were running the country. And the fact of the matter is that the United States, until recently, had dropped its combat role. We were just there to advise and assist. But then when ISIS came in and the Taliban started winning, President Ghani asked us to become more aggressive. And that so-called mother of all bombs did not kill any civilians. Now, civilians have been killed in other airstrikes, no doubt about it. But that time, no, it was dropped on the border with Pakistan. There were no civilian casualties, and it was dropped against ISIS to try and stop them from making a bad situation worse.
Okay. We just had Jason Unruhe, the U.S. President, be in Saudi Arabia recently. I'm sure you know that, and I'm sure you know the arms deal, $101 billion, was it? I forget how much exactly, but up to $350 billion over the next 10 years. Now, the U.S., by doing that, is sending a message, as U.S. President Donald Trump did, to Iran within his speech, saying, accusing Iran, of course, Iran has rejected it, about how Iran is destabilizing the region. Now, if you want to connect the dots, they are not winning in Syria. They want to put pressure on Iran. The U.S. President has said that. Saudi Arabia has said that. Do you think that Afghanistan is what's playing out right now because Iran has come out and said the support for Daesh terrorists that are coming from some of the regional countries, i.e. probably Saudi Arabia, therefore can put pressure on Iran. And this way Iran would expend its energy in different battlefields, just like Russia would?
I would certainly think that there would be some kind of U.S. policy to try to split the attention of Iran between multiple countries. And Iran that's focused on Syria is going to be far more effective in assisting the Assad government against foreign intervention. I wouldn't be surprised if this was true, and the U.S. was trying to manipulate Iran into involving itself in other conflicts, particularly one that is as bogged down as it is in Afghanistan. But it's really questionable whether or not such a tactic would actually work, because the Iranian government seems particularly clear-headed on deciding which incidents to become involved with and which they are not to become involved with. But I think overall it would be a good strategy by the United States.
Lawrence Korb, same question to you, again, with a stated aim of having Russia and Iran expend their energy in different and multiple fronts.
No, I think basically the arms deal with the Saudis is basically because they're the leader in the fight against ISIS. And that's why we want them to do more. As you may remember,
but ISIS, you said ISIS is in Afghanistan now.
You know what? Out of
based on what you said,
no,
and you call it ISIS,
okay.
We call them Daesh.
Okay, all right. I don't think the United States basically, you know, Trump didn't even mention Afghanistan in his campaign, and as I mentioned, Obama wanted to get out. I don't think they want to drag Iran down. What they want is they would like Iran to play the same sort of role they played after 9/11. People forget that the Iranian government was the only Middle East country that I know of that condemned the attacks, and they helped us. In talking with Brahimi, he, you know, at the Bonn conference, he said without the Iranian help, we wouldn't have been able to get the Karzai government in there. So they were very, very helpful.
Sorry, I got to jump in.
Everybody wants a stable
I do apologize.
Afghanistan.
I'll have to jump in to end it with Jason Unruhe. 30 seconds. Where to now for Afghanistan? What needs to be done? 30 seconds, please.
Oh, Afghanistan's in a terrible situation right now, and there seems to be no clear victor for the near future. The United States seems absolutely determined to continue its occupation, and the Taliban sees absolutely no reason to succumb to the U.S. occupation. Both sides do lack serious legitimacy, and I think this conflict is still going to go on for quite some time without either side really taking much power.
Thank you, Jason Unruhe, political commentator and analyst, and Lawrence Korb, thank you, U.S. foreign policy and national security analyst. Thanks for tuning in to another edition of The Debate. From me, Kavitahwe, and the entire team in the capital, Tehran, goodbye.